Okay, well, I see it's 11:30 in Central Time and 12:30 in Eastern. So let's go ahead and kick off today's session on our Leadership at Lunchtime series. So before I introduce our guest speaker, what I'd like to do is remind you of kind of how we do this. It's about 15 minutes of content, and that's talking with the subject matter experts and kind of getting some foundational work, and then a series of questions from you afterwards. So if you have questions that you would like to address to the speaker or myself, send them in the chat function to Erica or Adam, and they'll be able to facilitate those questions to us. So with that said, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome Brigadier General retired Scott Brower to join us today to talk about making decisions under fire. Scott has got an incredible background. If we go back to the military, he was commander of 5th Special Forces Group. He was the deputy commanding general of the 1st Operations Command. He was the DCG of the 101st Airborne. When he retired, he became the senior military advisor to Austin Peay State University. And today, Scott is serving in the position of Chief of Staff on the Unified Command for COVID-19 in the state of Tennessee. So with all of that said, I can't think of anybody that would have better visibility into making decisions under fire than Scott Brower. Scott, welcome. You've muted.
Thanks, Mike. Nope, not anymore. So I got it. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. Glad to be here with y'all.
Oh, I am so excited. This is a long way removed from those Sun Dragon 6 Friday morning runs we used to do about 30 years ago.
Very, very true.
So, hey, let me kick off a couple questions, and we'll go some back and forth. And I mean, the intent here is to be casual and comfortable. And I think the first question that really kind of grabs me is, during a crisis or during times of difficulty, we tend to think of a sense of urgency in decision making, that decisions need to be made faster. And unfortunately, we may have to make calls without full situational visibility, on limited information. So how do we build, or balance that speed of decision making with the uncertainty of not having enough information available to us that we might be comfortable with?
Mike, a couple thoughts on that one. One, I think leaders need to be very, very clear on when decisions need to be made. I've seen it all too often where in the need to get more information and understand the situation to make a well-informed decision, leaders sometimes will wait too long, and then the decision is made for them. So at times you have to identify when the decision needs to be made, and then you work to achieve as much of the information to assist you in making that decision as you possibly can until that point. But that's where uncertainty, hits a point where it doesn't matter how much uncertainty you have to make that decision. So to assist in that, I think what leaders can do is, one, identify when the decision needs to be made, and two, identify for their people that are working with them what information is critical to them in assisting in making that decision. In the information world nowadays, there is just an ungodly amount of information that can be thrown at a leader, the vast majority of which will be irrelevant to making a decision they need to make. So that clarity of what's important to them, I think, is very, very critical. And then the other piece is knowing when you have to make the decision.
Yeah, and following on with that, we kind of see that there's an analysis paralysis in the best of times because people want to make the perfect decision. And the quote I've heard is, perfect is the enemy of good. And so I love those 2 points that you just made.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the next question that kind of follows from that, and that's that tempo of decision making. And if we make it in the context of less than perfect insight, every now and then we're going to have a misstep. We may make a poor decision. What do leaders need to do to kind of act and react when they've made a poor call?
The first thing I would offer is own it. If you've made a bad decision, own it, right? And no one's trying to make a bad decision. You're trying to do the right thing. You have limited information, and you're not going to get it right all the time. You're a human being, so sometimes you're going to miss. And when you, as the leader, are people going to lose confidence in me? You've made a bad call. Well, if you don't acknowledge it, I think you do have the potential of losing their trust. But if you're man or woman enough, if you're a strong enough leader, to stand up in front of people and say, hey, you know what? I messed that up. And this is what we're going to do about it, right? So you communicate with them, you explain why you made the decision, and then you adjust from there. But I think when you can acknowledge the fact that you've made a mistake and share that, that assists you in establishment of trust right there. You're not hiding your flaws or your shortcoming with anybody. And I think that has a tremendous impact on the people that you're working with when you're confident enough to, to show that trust in them that, hey, I'm communicating with you. I'm telling you I messed it up. And now we're going to go ahead and adjust our plan. I think that goes a long way to addressing that challenge right there.
I think you also, what you're talking about is having personal courage. And it's a threat to ego when we make a mistake, and that personal courage and the self, ownership, the accountability to self of owning that, I think is a phenomenal characteristic of a good long-term leader as well.
Yeah. You're not pushing that decision on anybody else, right? It's not, well, you didn't give me enough information or you failed to provide me this. No, that if you set that guidance, you set that path, and then you get to that point and you made the call, that's on you, right? And that's the leader's responsibility.
I think what really resonates with me is the fact that by accepting ownership of it, you're more likely to have influence with folks. And passing it off to someone else and saying it wasn't my fault, or I didn't know that and someone didn't tell me, you're going to destroy the trust that you just said was so important for this.
Absolutely.
So, you've had a lot of times in your career where you've had to make hard choices, in trying and fast tempo conditions. As we think about it, the whole concept of making decisions under fire is very leader centric. The leader has to make the call. The leader has to move quickly. The leader has to be wise and display sound judgment, under trying conditions. We kind of forget the followers in this. And I think you and I both know that, the mission is executed through our people, and, their ability to buy in and have voice and say in those decisions presumes that we've got enough time to grab that in. So what I'd like to do is what do you think about leaders what recommendations would you have for our leaders to be able to balance the need for their people to have voice and say in the decision, but then to kind of fully, own the action moving forward? We used to say, you make your comments in quiet to the commander, and then when he says, yeah, but it's my call, you salute, say 3 bags full, and execute vigorously. So that's kind of the question I'm getting at here in a very terrible way.
Well, no, I think I understand that one. And, as far as getting your team to buy in, I think that goes a lot towards transparency and communication. And I say that, I'll use an example of when I was a deputy commander at 5th Special Forces Group. At that time, we were in 2 theaters of war. We had soldiers deployed in Afghanistan, we had soldiers deployed in Iraq, and we had soldiers deployed all across the Middle East on a variety of training exercises with our partners in the Middle East. And so the unit was very fragmented. The commander was forward in Iraq. I was back at Fort Campbell. And so the lack of synergy that existed inside the unit, you could have a company of 80 men inside the organization that were operating in 3 different countries in addition to the United States of America. And so, what's the direction that everybody's going was very, very difficult to understand. And so what I did at the time as the deputy commander that had the majority of the team back home was we created something called the State of the Legion Address, and mimicked off of the State of the Union Address, State of the State Address. And what it was periodically I would bring in what I considered to be the corporate leadership, right? Our field grade officers, our senior non-commissioned officers, and warrant officers. And I would bring them all in to one room, and I would say, hey, this is how I'm seeing things right now. I laid out the vision of where we were and what the priorities were. But the inclusion part came from, I explained to them, I'm like, hey, guess what? You're part of the corporate leadership now. You are no longer the element of the organization that's raging against the machine. You have an obligation to speak your mind. And so if you do not agree with where we're going, I need you to raise your hand. Or if I don't understand where a problem exists, you have an obligation and a duty to raise your hand and speak up and let me know what's going on so I can address it. And so, I put ownership on them, and that came with a voice and it came with responsibility. But what I had to do at that time though, is if there was an opinion or there was a recommendation that I did not agree with or I did not act upon, I absolutely had to go back and explain why I didn't do it, right? I had to share with them, this is why we're not going. I appreciated the input, and here's why I chose not to do it. And I think a lot of times leaders will ask for input, but sometimes when it's not chosen and it's not explained, people become, disenfranchised, right? They're like, okay, I've spoken up and I'm not being listened to right now, and I don't understand why. And it's the lack of understanding that causes the problem. So as we put that kind of into play, the more and more we did it, right? And we only met maybe every 3 or 4 months. And then, then I would start getting more and more input, from the subordinate leaders. And then they asked to go down another layer inside the organization of leadership. That happened in 2010. That unit in the military has gone through, they're on their 4th or 5th commander since me, and they still implement that tool because they found it as something that was valuable, right? And it wasn't so much the leader, because the leaders coming in new, it was the members of the organization that recognized the value in that communication structure. And I found that to be extremely important, in that recommendation there, as far as giving them the feedback. The other thing that I'll offer on how to get buy-in, and it's something that I think leaders tend to shy away from at times. And at the end of the day, I think everybody just generally, you want to have a good, positive relationship with people, right? And when things are going well, it's awesome. But when there's a problem and a leader ignores the problem, that's where lack of trust and lack of buy-in to an organization takes place. Because if you think you're the only one that recognizes there's a problem, you're wrong, right? I mean, the subordinates more often than not understand the problem much better than you do, because they're the recipients of the poor behavior, the inefficient structure, whatever it is, right? They have to deal with the problem. And when you choose to, recognize it's there and then not deal with it, well, now you're not being a good leader, and your subordinates become frustrated with that. So when leaders ignore the problem, I tend to think that they become part of the problem then. And honestly, I think in my experience, what I've seen is when commanders hesitate and don't deal with something to try to give somebody another chance, more often than not, it backfires on them, and they regret it later on. They wish they had pulled the trigger. And that gets back into, how much information you have, how much time you have to make a decision. So I'll stop there.
Well, I think we should go on for hours there. That's fantastic.
Well, I agree.
Let me come back to a couple things you've said. So the idea of, let's start with humility, courage from the last question, and then, the ownership of the leader to make decision, but also the fact is that you're not an isolated point of, in the world. I love the idea of coming back and explaining to people as time allows why you made a call, not just because it lets them know they were listened to and their voice was heard in the context of the greater scheme, but it also kind of gives you an opportunity to coach them on your thought process and maybe some of the critical planning factors that are relevant to the decision you're making that they may not have seen. And so that actually turns into a really good moment for you to kind of groom the thought processes of those leaders that are more junior to you and that support you in the organization.
Yeah, absolutely it does. And when you have that communication flow going with your subordinates too, guess what happens? You each gain a better appreciation for how you all think, what you think, how you react to information, how you respond. And when you have that understanding and you get into a time of crisis where time becomes the most critical factor, understanding how your subordinates work, think, them knowing how you receive information, how you react to is hugely important, right? Because it cuts down on the need for time to resolve issues right there. And that is what allows for speed, to increase. I know what my boss is thinking. I know what information he needs. I know how she, receives information, which is incredibly important. And I've seen that here in my short period of time working for Governor Lee. We're as a state, right, as a nation, as a world right now, we are in a time of crisis with this COVID problem. And, I've seen where people, I've very quickly learned how he receives information, what information is important to him. And I was surprised to see some on his staff didn't really understand that. And I don't say that as a criticism of anybody. It was the first time they were in a crisis situation. It was not the normal state architecture churning on a budget cycle or legislative cycle. It was something new. And so everybody saw something new from each other, both from the governor as a leader and then his commissioners, the legislators, and other folks that they were dealing with. So very, it's good to understand those information requirements and kind of personal default mechanisms.
And following on with that, you actually don't win in a crisis during the crisis. You win by getting it right before the crisis.
Without a doubt.
Because that's not the time to do discovery learning.
No, it's so true. At Austin Peay State University, we have a retired Lieutenant General Marine. Ron Bailey is our Vice President for External Affairs. And for the last 6-8 months, we periodically grab our senior leadership team and we go through crisis response exercises. And it's literally around the table, and he and I will gin up some devious, scenario, and then, we'll just run the team through it. And it allows leaders to think through the problem and maybe see things. But I guarantee you, us doing a scenario 6-8 months ago on a tornado hitting our campus, which happened over 20 years ago, but just running through that scenario or an active shooter drill, I guarantee you that helped our leaders in making decisions at Austin Peay as far as how to deal with the coronavirus. The scenario was completely different, but the communication structure and how you interact with people, the foundation had been set already by the university president, Dr. Elisa White.
Okay. I think that's a great segue to the last question I want to ask, and then let's get to the questions that
Sure.
The 100 folks that we have listening want to ask. So your current experience, Chief of Staff on the Unified Command COVID-19 Task Force, your experience in the military, all of that kind of gets you to a very unique intersection of understanding of the world that leaders are in a crosshairs, particularly during a crisis. And so what advice would you give to young and maybe not so young leaders right now as they're in the crosshairs with this crisis?
Well, I'll tell you, the absolute first thing is be the calm in the middle of the storm. You as a leader have a responsibility to help everybody else deal with it. That's the crux of leadership right there, right? Is be that calm, smooth influence over others as they are dealing with these unfamiliar, uncomfortable, very complex, and just very weighted decisions that they're all dealing with. And when you can provide that calm, I think that it goes a long, long way. I can't overstate that. The other piece I'll say is over-communicate, right? It gets back to the need to make decisions quickly. If you maybe had to adapt your organization, you've gone to some kind of ad hoc structure, you're not dealing with things in a normal routine manner, over-communicate, flatten your communications, share broadly, share often, and then when you think you've done it enough, do it one more time, right, just to make sure. Establish a vision as a leader, explain to people where you're going, and then you revise it along the way as more and more information comes in. And then if I didn't mention it, you need to communicate and over-communicate again and again and again, and make sure it's clear. Military, there's a term, Napoleon's corporal. As leaders will send information out, to their subordinates, Napoleon Bonaparte, he would grab his corporal and say, read these instructions. And if that corporal could understand it, he knew when the message went out, his generals could understand it so that there was no confusion. But that clarity, the direction, and the calm, I think are the most critical things that a leader can do at time of crisis when they're in those crosshairs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I remind everyone that we're scheduled for an official 30 minutes, but we tend to go longer with questions. And so I'm going to turn it over to please feel free to sign off if you have to, when you have to. And the same for you, Scott. So let us know kind of how, how your timing's looking.
We're doing okay.
All right, excellent. So Adam and Erica, let's go ahead and kick off some questions.
All right, I'll kick the first one off, and this one's for Scott, and it's kind of along the lines of what you were just talking about in terms of communicating in ways that we can care for our people. Kind of a full circle question. And so given the serious impact of many decisions that are being made right now, my question is more about how to make those hard choices while still caring for my people, that balance, and then how to live with it after things calm down.
So Adam, what I would offer is, I think as a leader, if you go through things in a truly altruistic manner, you're going to be okay, right? You'll be able to live with yourself on the back end. That understanding also that you're never going to make everybody happy. It's not going to happen. And I'll use the COVID crisis right now. I literally watch on a daily basis as Governor Lee makes decisions. No matter what decision he makes, the phone never stops ringing. He's upset somebody. But what I find very interesting, it goes right back to the communication piece. As he or other leaders on the team go and explain the thought process on how they reached a decision, right? They communicate the thought process to whoever's upset. The level of anger, anxiety, frustration almost always reduces, right? I've seen people that were upset that you haven't closed the, society fast enough, or now I can't believe you closed society. And when we explain the rationale for doing it, people generally go, okay, that makes sense, right? May not like it, but it makes sense. And that's what I think is really what comes into play. And I've found as you make hard decisions, whatever it is, and I mean, I've sent people into combat that didn't come back, and that wasn't the intent. That's not what I wanted to have happen. And I've engaged with their families afterwards and have remained friends with their families to this day. And they also understand that was not the intent of what I was trying to do. The result was not what we necessarily expected or wanted, but I made the decisions I made in a truly altruistic manner that was trying to accomplish a goal for the greater good. And it wasn't about self-serving interests. Does that get close? Did I get even close to answering it?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Scott. My next question is, in our workplace, we are seeing a lot of frustration and outright anger. A lot of it is directed at things that I can't control. But as I make tougher and tougher choices, I expect that anger to get directed at me. So how can I prepare for that?
I think there's, it goes right back to the communication piece, Erica. I think when you try to explain things to people, it generally helps. And I think regardless of whether they like the answer or not, the fact that you as a leader took the time to engage with them and explain to them, I think, the frustration levels generally reduce. And I'll give you an example. When I was the United States Army Special Operations Command Chief of Staff, I was a colonel. It was a 3-star headquarters, and we were dealing with the federal shutdowns at the time, waiting for the next stand up of the government. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the words right now, but we had to send all the federal civilian workforce home. And then Congress authorized the majority of them to come back. And there was 3 groups that were not allowed to come back to work for like an additional 2 weeks. And when they came back, finally, there was one of the groups that was just extremely frustrated. They were very angry. So I went and spoke to them. And I explained to them, and remember, these people, they stayed at home, and then when the federal government stood back up, they got paid, right? So they didn't lose any pay. They were paid for staying home. right? Because it wasn't their fault. And then they came in, but they were extremely angry that they didn't get to go to work at the same time their peer group did, because they wanted to participate and help in the mission of the organization. And I explained to them, I said, you know what? I wanted you back at work too. But Congress, and I wasn't blaming Congress, I'm like, Congress made a decision to keep these groups home for a reason for another 2 weeks. And now you're back. And I watched, you know, the anger slowly dissipated as I engaged with them. And it didn't disappear, but it was a lot less going out. I was able to take off my helmet, my flak jacket, right? I felt safe walking around. I wasn't going to get beat up in the hallways or anything. But I'm just joking about that. I never felt that way, right? But I felt the engagement and that communication piece helped with it. But again, right, at the end of the day, not everyone's going to be happy.
Scott, you just said something I think is quite powerful, which is that very often as leaders, we're enacting the decision-making of leaders above us of an institution. Yeah. And as long as they are ethical and moral decisions, you know, we're obligated to prosecute those to the full extent of our effort. And that while we can acknowledge those leaders' decisions above, we never say, well, I didn't want to do this, but I was told to do it, because that undermines our own leadership. And I really appreciate, you know, what you just said about communicating. This was the will of Congress. There's a reason for it.
Right.
And that's why we did it. And you own the decision, even though it was passed down to you.
Yeah, would agree.
Yeah.
Scott, I've got another question, and it kind of relates to what we were just talking about. But what is the best way to address decisions from above that you know are incorrect as a second level leader in an organization?
So Adam, I think, you know, if it's an incorrect decision, I think Mike touched on it. You have an obligation to go back to the boss or the leader above you and address that with them. And I absolutely, you know, ascribe to what Mike described earlier, right? You know, you criticize and complain and go through those conversations in private behind closed doors. You commend and applaud and reward in public, right? But if you're disagreeing with your boss because you think there's something wrong, now I'm not, you know, immoral, unethical, illegal, that's one whole set. But if it's just you think it's a poor decision, then you have that obligation to go back and have that conversation with them, I believe. Now, I think a corollary to that would be, now, how do you as a leader avoid that happening? What do you do to try to prevent that from happening to yourself? And I think, one, establishing that open communication with your subordinates. But, you know, in the military, we have somebody, you know, commanders have command sergeant majors. And one of my former command sergeant majors is working with me on this task force for Tennessee right now. Just walked in with my lunch, right? He was looking after me and making sure I'm taken care of. And that's the nice thing to do. But I always charged, right, my right-hand man, my closest confidant, I'm like, hey, if you see me doing something stupid, I'm charging you. It's your responsibility and obligation to grab me and tell me that. You know, if I ever heard you, you know, say to me later, like, well, I knew that was going to go wrong, right? That would upset me. But if you come in and tell me, hey, boss, I don't think that's a good decision, and this is why, hey, I appreciate that. But how you handle that and react to that, you don't have to agree with that person, but how you receive that, right, and how you handle that is extremely important. Because the first time they come in and say, hey, boss, I think that was a really, really bad call, and you blow up on them, guess what's never going to happen again? No one is ever going to walk in and tell you, Emperor, you're wearing no clothes right now.
You know, what's really interesting in that as well is you've got to be able to separate your ego from your role identity. Because when people tell you they don't agree with it, and your ego's so tied up in who you are and what you're doing, it becomes threatening to you as a person. And so, you know, Colin Powell said, you know, never let, you know, keep your ego at arm's length, so that, you know, that when the job fails, you don't fail with it, or when the decisions are poor, you know, it doesn't attack you.
So I was on that, Mike, I was a brand new battalion commander at 5th Special Force Group at Fort Campbell, and I was going to talk to my unit for the first time as the commander. And I was getting ready to walk into the hall where I was going to talk to him. And I went to open the door, and one of the sergeant majors, who now my older daughter calls her father-in-law, but as I was getting ready to go in, he opened the door for me. And I'm like, hey, Sergeant Major, I can open the door for myself. And his comment to me, this is 14 years ago, still sits with me. He goes, hey, sir, I didn't open the door for you. I opened the door for the battalion commander, right? And his point was, the position you're in is our leader, and I'm showing respect to our leader. But don't get too big for your britches, buddy, right? You're just a human like me. And so that one stuck with me still.
I've had a couple of those emotional moments in my life as well.
Right.
So back to you, Erica and Adam.
Thanks, Mike. So my next question is from one of our viewers. In making decisions under fire, how far a line of sight should a leader have? There could be several ways of measuring this, such as tasks, months, etc.
Erica, what I would offer is, as the leader, as far as you can, or as far as you're responsible for, right? I mean, obviously, within your responsibility, but I think the leader's responsibility is to look out as far as they possibly can. And I say that, right? What do people default to? They default to what they know, and often that maybe is the job they came from, or as a subordinate. So when things get uncomfortable, you revert to where you were comfortable and what you know and what you've done before. And often that, when leaders, I think, don't do as well as they could, they tend to fall back on that, and that is solving the problems that your subordinates are now responsible for. So, and everyone looks at the problem right in front of them. I'll tell you, going through this COVID crisis, as we started this, it was about flattening that curve and stopping the bleeding right now, right? And so we were dealing with the problem of today, and then whatever problem popped up right in front of our face. But now, as things have kind of calmed a little bit, it's not time to go back to normal at all. But at this point, now we're thinking about 3 months out, 6 months out. How do we change what we're doing? When we go back to normal, it's not going to be what we came from. It's going to be a new normal. So leaders have to think about that, when they have the time. And what I would tell you is, I highly recommend that leaders, you have to find time to think, right? And not just, be doing email all day long or in meetings all day long. You have to carve out time that you set aside so that you can set the vision and the path for the organization you're responsible for. I don't care if that's a little league softball team or if it's a Fortune 500 company. What are you trying to accomplish? What's the vision you have? Right? You have to take the time to carve it out and to think. And all too often we ignore that piece of it and focus on the tasks of the day.
Scott, I've got a kind of question that piggybacks the theme of kind of what do leaders need to kind of fill their cup. So as a leader, you clearly don't have all the answers and have to phone a friend or mentor or seek out mentorship at times. What are your thoughts on reaching out to a completely isolated third party to help you walk through a difficult situation and give you the much needed input? And when, if ever, have you done this in your career?
I think outside resources can be helpful and different points of view can be helpful. And obviously you have to avoid group thought, right? And where everyone's, oh, boss, that's a great idea. Oh, yeah, I love that idea, right? Or everyone's thinking the same way. So having diversity in thought from people that surround you, I think is helpful. And assigning somebody, you can assign somebody as a leader, say, hey, guess what, Adam, you are my devil's advocate, right? I want you to be the one that is always coming forward with a dissenting opinion, right? Because it may not be correct, but give us something to argue and discuss, right? Let's think about it from a different perspective. And then, people from different backgrounds can be very, very helpful, right? They look at things differently. That's why in the military, you have a commander and a sergeant major. You're looking at the problem, the same problem, but through a different lens. Now, bringing in, at time of crisis, I'm not a big fan of bringing in external entities expecting that they're going to solve a problem. Now, if they're a technical expert, that's one thing. If we're talking about microbiology, right, I don't have any idea how to spell it, nonetheless, what it's telling me. So, getting a technical expert to assist is of tremendous value. But and that's what I want them for. But as far as setting the vision, the way ahead, I don't necessarily want a lot of outside random thoughts. I want to turn to people that I know, I have a relationship, and I know the information they're going to give me is going to be honest and it's going to be useful to me.
Scott, let me also tag on. The idea of having a devil's advocate is a fantastic one. If we think about, way back to the days of National Training Center and those things, the red team, would spend their days and nights figuring out ways to destroy our strategies. And so having someone on the team that actually predicts where is this going to fail, what are the fault lines, what are the weak spots, is a very powerful way of making certain that your strategy is true and that you've got good contingency plans made for it.
Yeah, absolutely. My time in Special Forces, I didn't have too much trouble finding a couple thousand people that would offer different opinions on how to do something better. So
that's kind of a hiring criteria to get into SF.
Yeah, it may very well be. Absolutely.
Okay, I have another question for you. In a world where after the fact scrutiny of decision making is so prevalent, how do you balance the awareness that you may be under a microscope later with the need to make those tough decisions in the moment?
Erica, on that one, I'd say document and record your actions as soon as you're dealing with crisis, right? I mean, we're talking about, dealing in crisis right now. And so now you've gone into some kind of ad hoc thing. You're not in your normal structure. You're not dealing with your normal problem sets. So start documenting what you're doing early. Because, right now, and I'll use the current crisis again, we've been making decisions based on what we've been watching going around the country right now. And so when you don't have time to think through and you think the decision needs to be made right away, well, you make the decision. And now when the environment changes and you have more time, and this gets back to, it may not even be a wrong decision, but the decision is no longer relevant. The environment's changed so much that what you were planning on doesn't make sense anymore. And now we're going to adapt and adjust, to the new circumstances. And I'll use, we had planned on building out the Music City Center for an alternative care site here in Nashville to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And now that we've seen that bed capacity most likely won't be needed, and that could only be a short-term solution. Now that we have more time and the environment is changed, well, we shut that plan down, and now we're moving to other plans right there. Well, every decision that was made, I'm comfortable with how it was made and was part of the people, the group making the recommendations. But 2 years from now, when an auditor comes in and I'm not here anymore and most of the bosses aren't here and there's other people, how the heck do you explain it to an auditor when they say, wow, why did you spend taxpayer dollars on this and you never even used it? Well, 2 years from now, unless you have that documentation, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think, that documenting up front, right, for historical purposes is hugely important in these times of crisis. I also believe in being open and being transparent as much as possible. Bring people in to review, have a sounding board, have somebody else come in and look at it and go, holy cow, why are you doing it this way? There's a better way of doing it. Great, let's do that. And then admit to mistakes. Again, people are human, and when people get in trouble is, when a mistake's been made and then you try to cover it up, that's where the problem comes about. Admit to the mistakes that were made, right? I have a former Army aviator that keeps telling me it all buffs out, right? Whatever the problem is, it'll buff out eventually. And that I think is generally true as long as you're being honest.
One of the the attendees posed a really great kind of scenario-based question. And so recently they spoke with a nurse who's trying to manage the dissonance between her personal principles and integrity and the decisions of her supervisors relative to the safety of the nursing staff. She's made her concerns known, the decision is made, she needs to implement. For a leader in a fast-moving environment with high stakes, what could help a leader like her make her implementation decisions with as much integrity as possible?
This gets into, I think that's a very challenging situation right there. And again, I always default to moral, ethical, and legal, right? I mean, you can disagree with the decision of a leader, but if it's moral, ethical, and it's legal, and you choose to remain being part of that organization, you're somewhat obligated then to follow those decisions. To go along with that though, is if you disagree with it, that gets back into that communication going back up. But and something in the military we always talked about was, don't come to me with a problem, come to me with a solution, right? So if you've identified a problem, I expect from leaders to come back to me with a recommendation on, hey, this is not working right now, or this is problematic, but I believe we should take steps 1, 2, and 3 to improve upon that situation right there. And then you're right back in that decision-making cycle again of, the leader can go with it. He could stick to his or her guns on what they've directed. And then, if it's legal, moral, and ethical, then, you stick with it, or, you choose to separate yourself from that organization, which I know, God bless our nursing community and the medical community as a whole, all of our first responders right now with what they're dealing with. Unbelievably humbling to watch what they're doing, and unbelievably taxing. So I hope that came close to answering the question, but to that community, God bless each and every one of you for what you're doing right now.
Erica, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Sorry, I was sorting through questions. So I have one more for you. Actually, no, I've got another. I've got two just came in. So my next question is, what are your opinions of recent publications that lend a military perspective to leadership? For example, extreme ownership, the dichotomy of leadership.
So I don't know what articles we're referring to there, but I'll tell you, having been outside of the military about 18 months now, and I say outside of it, I still live 8 miles from Fort Campbell, where I spent about 14 years of my career, and I see it and touch it. And the reason why we were brought down here to join the Unified Command Team was to kind of apply a military approach. This is not a military operation, but the decision-making process, having a very structured system to do that, was why we were brought in. Excuse me. And I think there is a lot to offer as far as, applying military principles to the civilian sector. I have a very good friend of mine, Rob Salome's a retired Army colonel, infantryman, works for Solutions 21, which is an organization that tries to help leadership challenges inside of corporate America nowadays. And Rob wrote a small article that talked about commander's intent and establishing commander's vision, right? And that's something that is just inherent in everything you do inside the military, right? You have the structured format, and one of the things the commander does is, hey, here's my intent, here's my vision, this is how I want to do things and where I want to go, and then you build your plan off of that. And what that does is it informs the subordinates of exactly where you're going and what they're responsible for and the timeline and all of that. It's very, very structured, but it provides clarity. And Rob's premise, to the article was, last century, and in the industrial age, you had a heck of a lot more time to kind of, stumble through things inside of an organization. But now the speed at which things move, whether it's in the military or outside, it's just so rapid that the need to make decisions happens so quickly. You have to decentralize things so much that your subordinates have the ability to act and function off of the guidance and the vision that you've set without having to come back and wait for you to respond to an email or set up an office call, right? And that's for routine types of things. And the more comfortable you are with each other, the quicker you can go and the more flexibility you get to kind of act upon those things. But so it's in areas like that I think there's a tremendous amount of value in looking at how the military does things, because it flattens communication. I think the military is always, this very rigid machine. I'll tell you, it's quite an adaptable machine, and it has so many responsibilities. I think there are things to learn. Just as I've watched the Special Operations Command spend time, going on a site for their senior leaders, on a site visit with FedEx, right, to learn about how a civilian company that's transforming, an industry, go learn from them as well, right? So I think you can learn from each other.
Scott, so I retired 17 years ago now, so I've had a couple years in the practice. When I hear people ask that question, very often they're using a very highly stylized element of leadership they saw from a Hollywood product, which is someone barking orders and everyone else must carry them out, and they don't see the below the surface activity that what you've just described. And I think there is a lot of value of putting a disciplined thought process, a shared doctrine, so a general understanding of an approach, or that process of how to approach. There's value there. But as you also said, it's also incredibly important to learn from other industries that are on the cutting edge of new leadership principles and techniques. As the new generations grow up, there are different expectations of how they want to be led. So we've got to kind of kit those into mind. And I know that leading millennials in the military, was a shock of cold water to a lot of the baby boomers that were in the senior leadership positions at that point.
Mike, you pull on something that makes me think, so even from before when I was at Austin Peay, but to now, Austin Peay State University sits 8 miles outside of Fort Campbell. And so we have a very collaborative relationship with Fort Campbell. We have a lot of their soldiers as students at Austin Peay, over 500 of them. But we did something when I was still on active duty where we took the coaches from the athletic department and the athletic department staff up to Fort Campbell. And we kind of did a team building event for them. But at the end of the day, what we did is we put those coaches in the same room as battalion and brigade command teams. And we had discussions on team building. When you have a high turnover, right, you lose X number of student athletes, your percentage every year, and you have soldier turnover all the time. And then we had a discussion on how to deal with millennials, right? Because at the end of the day, they think differently than I think. It doesn't mean they think incorrectly or wrong, or my way's better. It has nothing to do with that. It's they think differently, right? So understanding that as a leader, you have an obligation to understand how to communicate with your people. That's how you're going to be effective. And so we shared, right? We found commonalities between a civilian academic institution and the military, and we shared those best practices that I think benefited both.
Yeah, and it just tells me and reinforces my belief that all leadership is situational leadership. And you've got to be able to reach into your kit bag and pull out the behavior or approach that's relevant and appropriate for what's in front of you. Yeah. And that means that we as leaders consistently have to learn and grow. We can never be done. We always have to kind of evolve our leadership styles. Hey, we've got a couple more questions. Do you have a few minutes? I realize that Governor Lee in the state of Tennessee would like you to get back to work. Do you have time for a couple more?
Yeah, I think I can take 2 more. Then Governor Lee expects me to be in a meeting at a different location in about 42 minutes. Okay. So I think we can handle 2 more.
2 fast ones. Thank you, sir.
Sure.
All right. Thank you, Scott. And last one from me is the COVID pandemic has demonstrated the lack of visibility to information that leaders have within their organizations. What indicators or levels should leaders think about when making decisions with little or no information?
With little or no information, obviously is very, very complicated. And I default that, wow, that's a tough one right there. But with lack of information, I default to kind of, you go with what you know at that point of view, right? And then you have to be, as you start moving in a direction, and you gain a little bit more information and a little bit more information, I think that gets into the art of leadership versus the science of leadership, right? Where as you're inching along, you have to be able to react and adapt quickly to to new information that's leading your organization in a different way, whether that's new regulations and laws, or there's a new fabric for, the textile industry, or, whatever it may be. It can come in so many different ways, shapes, or forms, that as that information comes in, that you put it into your decision-making process and then adapt at that point. So again, it's, how risky is the environment that you're in. If it's not very risky, well, then you can move at a decent rate and keep moving forward. But if it's not, if it's extremely risky, then maybe you slow down a little bit more. You take a little bit more time. You kind of pause to figure out, how to move forward as information comes in. But it gets back to, I think, where we started this conversation of, you have to understand when the decisions have to be made, and you get as much information in an organized manner as you can by identifying what's important to you, and then you make those decisions when you have to.
Thanks, Scott. So my last question actually kind of tacks on to what we were just talking about. It came from one of our viewers. In the current crisis, we are receiving conflicting data on a daily and even hourly basis from our leadership. How do you maintain a consistent message to your staff so that you can actually move forward?
I was hoping this wouldn't turn into a COVID-19 update, but I think it's a great example of dealing with crisis right now, because at the end of the day, the information is changing every hour. And again, I'm not trying to avoid the question at all, but I think it really comes down to, again, the leader identifying what information is of value to them that helps them make decisions. And I've seen in this situation where so many people are offering data, and there's been a variety of models, and the models will tell you one thing one day and they tell you something else the next day. I think what I offer out of that is, when, stick to your core beliefs, right? And stick to your core values in those situations of what you're trying to set out to do. And I know that doesn't answer, it may not answer perfectly this question, but I truly believe, if you have a vision, if you have, a direction you're trying to take your organization, even with limited information in a very complex and volatile environment, you try to stay true to that as much as you possibly can, understanding the danger and risk associated with it when the information is not very, very clear. I hope that helps and came close to answering the question.
Scott, I think it does, because if we take it back to your first thing that you think leaders should do, which we all know is to calm the storm, to keep, to keep the ship stable. There's the realm of the possible, there's the realm of the probable. And all of that collectively creates noise, and noise in the environment leads to anxiety and panic and anger and fear and frustration. We as leaders should be talking about the probable. We should be focusing on those things that are important to our decision-making process and start filtering out the noise, and to help people kind of see that that's part of our role as a leader, is to help make some sense of that. So look, we have taken more than we should have of your time today. So General Scott Brower, I want to first thank you for 3 decades plus of service to the nation. And then thank you so much for your service right now to the state of Tennessee. And then when this is all over, your service to the State University, Austin Peay, and the students and folks there. I really, really appreciate you coming in today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mike. I enjoyed it. You all take care and have a great day, okay?
All right. Be safe.
Take care. Bye now.
All right. So for those that are still here, we're going to do this again next week. We'll be talking with Dr. Amy Cathy in and around communications in a crisis. So stay in touch with us, stay in touch with each other, be safe, be healthy. Thank you so much for your time.